Alright guys, continuing on, we're up to period 4, which is 1800 to 1848. This period will basically be signified at the beginning by the end of what is called Federalist power with the election of Thomas Jefferson, who was originally an anti-Federalist and became known as a Democratic Republican. And in 1848, we will end it up with kind of the start of the road to the Civil War. All right, so we're going to start off with the era or presidency of Thomas Jefferson when he comes into power in 1800. One of the terms you need to associate with him is his election is referred to as the Revolution of 1800. Now, the reason it's called that is because this is the first time in our country's history, and granted we're very young at this point, but this is the first time we've had a transition in power from one faction, or as we'll know them later on, political party, from one party to another. Because up to this point, the first two presidents were Federalists, and Jefferson is not. He was an anti-Federalist during the debates over the Constitution, and comes to be known as a Democratic Republican. So there was a lot of interest in what would happen as this power, these viewpoints on power changed with the change in presidents. All right, so the things you need to associate with Jefferson as far as his philosophy or the tenets of what is known as Jeffersonian democracy, which you probably will have to compare with Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian democracy at some point, is first of all, it comes from Jefferson believed that the power of the country came from the yeoman farmer or the common man. Okay, he believed that they were the most virtuous. Examples of people under Republican governments, and therefore power rested with them. In other words, the government should work for them. He believed in states' rights. As I said before, he was an anti-federalist, so he was very wary of the power of the central government. He believed that too much power could slip us back into tyranny. And also for that reason, like it says, he was for smaller government. He was more about the power of the government being with the state. One of the first tests of Jeffersonian democracy in his viewpoint or vision of how government should work is going to be the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the background on it, here's how it goes. If you look at the map, Louisiana Territory is basically what you see shaded in green, and at the southern tip of it is the port of New Orleans. Now, we're in control of all this land to the east of the Louisiana Territory, and we have a lot of farmland there. And during this time period, because of the lack of infrastructure and transportation developments, it was actually more expensive to transport farm goods over land from what we'll call the west, right in here, over to the east. Then it was more expensive to do that than to take it down the Mississippi River to New Orleans and then take it by boat around to these places. And also, if you've got a port, you can go into the Gulf of Mexico and then export some of these crops and products internationally as well. So we're going to try to get this port of New Orleans from France and from Napoleon. So we send a representative down to try to buy it for, and I apologize, I'm looking at my notes here. I don't have it in there, but I think 10 million is the number. So we're going to offer to buy the port of New Orleans for $10 million or however much it is. Well, the bottom line on it is France and Napoleon are in the midst of a little bit of chaos. The Haitian Revolution has just happened, plus Napoleon's got some problems at home with things becoming pretty inflammatory with Britain. So at this point, he's ready to wash his hands of the New World. He's ready to get out of the New World or Western Hemisphere business. So when we go to try to buy the port of New Orleans, he offers us the entire territory, and it becomes a very conflicting thing for Jefferson in the fact that there is nothing in the Constitution that talks about buying territories from foreign governments or anything like that. So he's scared him doing this will be an overreach of his presidential powers. So he has an internal conflict on what to do. Well, at the end of the day, he realizes that his strict constructionist viewpoints on the Constitution is not as important as what is best for the American people. So we buy the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon for a ridiculously low price. And what happens is it opens up all this land for development, for use, for migration, and honestly, it's going to be the start of the conflict between the North and the South over the slavery debate, because once these territories become states, they got to determine whether they will have slavery or not. So a very important event in U.S. history, not only for the expansionist aspect of it, but also the conflict that is to come. All right, so another key thing during the early 1800s is going to be the Marshall Court. The Marshall Court is named after John Marshall, who was a Supreme Court justice during this time. Now, when you hear the words Marshall Court, the first thing that needs to hit your mind is federal over state power, because the majority or all of the decisions that were made by the Marshall Court lean towards giving power to the federal government over states and individuals. And there's three examples you need to be aware of when it comes to the Marshall Court that you might be asked to plug in at some point. The first is going to be Marbury versus Madison. Now, as far as the components of the case, you don't really need to know. You need to know the results, okay? And what comes out of Marbury versus Madison is a concept called judicial review, which basically said that the Supreme Court has the final say over laws. In other words, and I apologize for looking at my notes, but the Supreme Court has the right to rule that a law is unconstitutional. So that's what judicial review is. The next is going to be Dartmouth College versus Woodward. What it said is that a state could not encroach on a previous contract or a previously existing contract. So the bottom line on this one is, by this decision, it takes power out of the hands of the state, okay, and it gives it to the federal government, because he said only the federal government can go in and encroach or, work on a contract. And then lastly is McCulloch versus Maryland, which deals with the constitutionality of the national bank and the fact that the national bank takes precedence over the viewpoints on it by states. So once again, bottom line, they all deal with the power of the federal government being more important than the power of states. All right, so we move forward to the War of 1812. Like any war or event that we talk about, you need to know the causes and the consequences. But before we get to the causes, or within the causes, we need to talk about a couple of the things that we tried to do to avoid this war. And two terms you need to be aware of are the Embargo Act and the Non-Intercourse Act. Now, these were measures that we took against Britain and France to kind of keep us out of this conflict, okay? Because what happens in the War of 1812 is we get embroiled, as Washington warned against, we get kind of embroiled in foreign entanglements. So be aware of the Embargo Act, which is where we decided to punish both of these countries. We would stop exporting any goods to France or Britain. In other words, we're not putting anything on a ship and selling it to either of these countries. Now, we thought that would send a message for them to get it together, but it turns out, to be honest with you, we were not as important as we thought we were. And the fact that we weren't that much of, we didn't make that much of an impact on their economies, so they didn't really care. It didn't have any effect on them, and it basically devastated the American manufacturing and sector and the economy, because they were our two main trading partners. So it didn't work. So what we do is we amend it to the Non-Intercourse Act and try to make it a little bit less, a little not as harsh on American producers. And what we said is, okay, instead of cutting off all exports, we're going to cut off all exports to everybody but Britain and France. I apologize. I might have misstated previously. The Embargo Act, we sent no products to anywhere in the world. Okay, and what that comes down to is it ties into the causes. And one of the main causes was British impressment of American sailors. As we're shipping goods back and forth internationally, what would happen is British naval ships and the soldiers would board the American ship, and they would basically do what's called impress or kidnap or force American sailors to work on their ships, to come over to that side. And that was one of our main complaints against Britain. So the embargo and the Non-Intercourse Act really comes out of that. Also, there's a desire by a certain segment of people for some lands in Canada, and particularly the resources and fishing rights that come with it. The Impressment Act was kind of led to another cause, which is just their general interference in our trade, in our business. Okay, so they're trying to interrupt everything we do, and we don't like it. I mean, bottom line on it. And then also the British are giving aid in the form of weapons and supplies to Indians in the Ohio River Valley, to try to stir up trouble, to try to make things hard for us. So we have a pretty good list of legitimate complaints against Britain at this time. So eventually, through the efforts of a group of people, young Southerners and Westerners in Congress who were known as war hawks, war breaks out. Now, once again, you don't have to know any battles or anything like that, but the consequences of this war are pretty important. Number one, it leads to the end of the Federalist Party because of the debates that were happening as a cause of the war. It intensified nationalist feelings, which means for the first time, people more than ever began to identify themselves with America and take pride in the things that America did, and would defend the principles and the liberties and the freedoms that America stood for. It also promoted industrialization. That's partly because of the Embargo Acts and the Non-Intercourse Act, and the fact that we had to supply for ourselves. Because not only were we not sending any products out, we weren't taking anything in. So, we had to fend for ourselves, and we found that we could do a better job of that than we thought we could. And then lastly, and this comes out of the Battle of New Orleans, which actually took place after the War of 1812, but because of the length of time it took to get news back and forth, excuse me, he didn't know that. He becomes very famous off of this battle, and what it does is it launches his political career, which is what we're going to talk about a few slides from now. Okay, so we roll from Jefferson to James Monroe. Now, one of the key components of the Monroe administration, well, there's a couple, but the first one has to do with how are we going to improve our transportation network. How are we going to get products from one place to another internally more quickly and easily and cheaply? And the proposal that comes out of it is by a guy named Henry Clay from Kentucky with his what is known as the American system, which was going to deal with internal improvements and going to link all three um, regions of America through a transportation network. Also, and this is roads, this is canals and things like that. Another component of the American system were the tariffs. He wanted to institute not only to raise money, but also to protect American manufacturing and American factories, and the fact that it would cost more for imported goods to be sold. Now, there's a lot of opposition to this, and it doesn't really work. And the key part, excuse me, of why this doesn't work is that Clay wanted these improvements to be what is called federally funded, which means it's paid for by the national government. Well, a lot of states at this time, particularly in the South and in the West, do not approve of this because they feel like it's an encroachment or an invasion or a lessening of states' rights. So it comes back down to that initial debates that we had at the beginning of this country as far as federal versus states' rights. So we move over to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which is one of the first conflicts with regards to slavery within the United States. And it's particularly because we've got to, at this time, we've got to figure out what to do with the lands that we picked up in the Louisiana Purchase. Like I said earlier, as these lands became states, will they be slave states or non-slave states? And basically what it boils down to is Missouri applies for statehood, and the status of whether they will be a slave state or a non-slave state becomes a heated debate in Congress because if Missouri comes in as a slave state, it's going to tip the balance of power in the Senate because at this point they're equal. They're the same number of slave states and non-slave states in the country. So if Missouri comes in, southern states get more power. So they've got to figure out what to do. And like we've done up to this point, a lot in this country's history, at least up until 1820, compromise rules the day. So what they decide to do is they're going to allow Missouri to come in as a slave state, but to balance that out, they're going to allow Maine, the state of Maine, to come in as a non-slave state. So you keep what's called the sectional balance. Everybody has the same amount of power. And as a component of that, they decide for future purposes, they're going to draw a line at the latitude longitude line of 38, or at the latitude line of 3830, and above that line, any states that come in will not be slave states, and anything below that, if it happens, we'll worry about later. But all it boils down to is it's a way to keep the balance of power in the Senate. All right, so next is going to be the Monroe Doctrine, which is dealing with the influence and things with foreign powers. Okay, it's dealing with America in the world. And what we've decided is that um, Europe's having a little bit too much fun in the Western Hemisphere. So we come out with the Monroe Doctrine, and basically what we say is that if you're here, get out, and if you're thinking about coming to this side of the world, don't do it. So it's warning Europe against further colonial ventures in the Western Hemisphere, and it's to try to avoid the things that led to the War of 1812 and all this. It's basically asserting our power in this side of the world. All right, very briefly, before I have to wrap this up, at least part one of this, we move forward to the tenets of Jacksonian democracy. Once again, you'll have to compare these to Jeffersonian. There's four main components to Jacksonian democracy. Number one, there's a belief in the common man, which is a comparison or similarity with Jefferson. Number two, Jacksonian democracy dealt with expanded suffrage. What it did is it took out the land ownership to be able to vote, so more people were involved in the democratic process. Number three, it dealt with patronage, or as we call it, the spoil system, which means you reward your political supporters by putting them into office or into positions. We talked about the advantages and disadvantages of that. We'll deal with it later, but I'm running out of time. And last but not least is the opposition to elites, which means he didn't like things that were going on in the Northeast with the privileges and the things that Eastern bankers and merchants got. So he's more of a Southern Western guy. All right, that wraps up part one of period four. We'll move forward to period two part two on the next one.